Well, a U.S. couple went on a bucket list safari in Africa celebrating 30 years of marriage, but only one of them ever returned home after being found guilty of his wife's murder last year. The husband learned his fate earlier this week while being sentenced in a federal courtroom. And joining us again this week for the Legal Lowdown is attorney Lori Murray, who you might recognize as Lawyer Lori on TikTok. And Lori, there is so much to unpack with this one. So we have to start 2016 when dentist Lawrence Rudolph and his wife Bianca went to Zambia to go hunting. What happened while they were there?
This one, you're right. There's a lot to unpack, and honestly, there's so much we could fill a whole hour with it. But they went to hunt. They were big game hunters, which I don't approve of, but that's my personal opinion. But they went because she had not killed a leopard yet. So they were there celebrating. I think they've been married 34 years. And as they were leaving a month later, they were there for a month. As they were leaving a month later, he says he was in the bathroom. She was packing up. He says that she was putting the gun in the rifle, I guess, in its case, and it went off. She was actually shot in the heart. She died instantly and was found on the floor about 15 seconds later by one of the resort workers.
And it sounds like he wasted no time in filing life insurance claims. So how much money did he receive because of her death?
He received almost $5 million on her life insurance.
And I know he was found guilty of Bianca's murder last year. He was sentenced Monday. So how long will he be in prison?
He was sentenced. So this is a federal crime because it happened in another country. So he was sentenced to life in prison, which under the federal system is day for day. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. He was also sentenced to 20 years concurrent to that because of the mail fraud based on the insurance collection of proceeds that he didn't deserve because he filed the insurance claims for the life insurance.
Yeah, I know.
He was also, I didn't want to interrupt you, but he was also ordered to pay back that insurance money, plus received fines on top of that, totaling about $2 million.
Yeah, a whole lot being sentenced that he now has to repay. You mentioned it happened in federal court. I know he was sentenced in Colorado, even though he has homes in Phoenix and Pennsylvania. How else did the murder happening overseas affect this trial?
Well, I think that, being that it was overseas, it was investigated by the FBI and prosecuted by the Department of Justice. And with that, you get the federal system, which is federal sentencing. It becomes a harsher sentence. It becomes a day-to-day because there's no probation or parole in the federal system. So you end up with a much harsher sentence. He was eligible for the death penalty. We do have a federal death penalty. They just didn't seek it in this case.
I know a lot of people turn to motive. So some argue he didn't need the money. He has a practice worth $10 million. Is that an argument you think the defense took advantage of, or do you think they should have done more with that?
No, I don't think they could have. I think they didn't take full advantage of it, but the reason that was given that they didn't divorce because these two had an open marriage, according to his tearful testimony. They had an open marriage. She was having affairs. He was having affairs. But she refused to divorce him because she was Catholic. So the amount of money wouldn't have made any difference because there was never going to be a divorce.
Yeah, you mentioned those affairs. So we know about this girlfriend. Tell me a little bit about Lori Milliron. And I know she was also charged and sentenced in this crime.
She was. She received 17 years. She was his longtime girlfriend. I think they had been seeing each other since 2004. He killed his allegedly or now convicted of killing his wife in 2016. So they had a long-term affair. She worked in his office. She was a hygienist at first, then became an office manager. After his wife died, she became a partner. So they had this long-term affair. It is alleged that he killed his wife to be with her. It is also, she was convicted in this case of accessory after the fact and 2 counts of perjury, lying to the grand jury. And then I believe that there were 3 counts that she was found not guilty of. But she was convicted because she provided propofol, the Michael Jackson drug, to him before he left for this trip. So they believe that she had some kind of role in getting him to commit this murder. And also, the piece de resistance for the trial was a bartender that came in that overheard the 2 of them talking after the murder, where he said, "I killed my bleeping wife for you." So that was his confession that was put in the record, but that was all based on their relationship. The murder probably occurred because of their relationship. He wanted to go off and live a lavish retirement with her.
Well, like we said, there is a lot to unpack with this case, so we appreciate you joining us live to offer your expert insight. And make sure and tune in every Wednesday for the Legal Lowdown with Lori Murray, and for other cases in South Carolina and across the country that you need to know about. Give @Lawyer Lori a follow on TikTok.
And now.